So who wants to tell us what we looked at last time?
History.
We looked at some history. We did.
Did it start with a C?
I'm sure there was something in there that started with a C.
Canonization.
Yeah, we did talk about the canonization of the Old Testament. So the first thing we talked about is its development, how we got it, and how did we get the Old Testament? Did it fall from the sky?
Yes.
No.
No, it didn't.
No, it didn't fall from the sky. How did we get it?
We got it through, who was it from? Because God breathed the word.
I have the Old Testament right here. So how did that happen?
The scribes copied it.
Okay, so first it came from God. God moved upon the hearts of people to write in a way that was infallible and that was inspired. Okay, we talked about what inspiration means. What does that mean? That doesn't mean like being inspired as a painter to paint a picture or something. Huh? The word inspiration is made of two Greek words.
Actually, the actual word of God, right?
Huh?
It's actual. I don't remember the Greek word.
Well, it's pneuma theos.
Oh, yes.
Pneuma is breath. Theos is God, so it's the breath of God. It doesn't mean that He just kind of breathed on people. It mean that His word, you can't. That's how we make words, by our breath. If you exhaled all your air and tried to talk, you wouldn't make any sound. All right, sound is from our breath, and that's what it's referring to. That it is what they were claiming is that these words, although written by man, were actually God's word to us. Okay, so all right, very good. So we looked at that, and then God had to preserve that word. It was written so long ago, and we discussed the timing that it began to be written, although Job is a mystery. Moses began to write around what time? Roughly.
483 AD? I mean, BC?
What is it?
4 BC?
No.
It was something after the Exodus.
You're about 1,000 years too far in the future. So about 1420 BC.
I got two of the digits right.
You got some of the digits right. Yeah, about 1420, roughly speaking, and we know that about 1440 was Moses' death. He died 40 years after the Exodus. The Exodus occurred 480 years prior to the building of the temple, 966 AD. So if you do the math, you can get into the time that Moses died. He obviously didn't write it after he died, right? And he didn't write it after he was called by God to be a prophet. So you put in between the time, and you get around 1420 BC. Okay, so that's when it began to be written. It was concluded about 420 BC, the Old Testament, that is. So about 1,000 years in writing. And so God did not only let it fall from the sky, He didn't give it to one person either. Unlike some cults that we know that all originate in one person behind closed doors and no one ever saw how they got it. But we have about 30 different men over the span of about 1,000 years who contribute to the Old Testament. And those men were men of different backgrounds, from poor men to rich men, different parts of the world, and they all tell the same story. That's miraculous. That's miraculous. We can't even agree on the story, but they all told the same story. So that is miraculous. And so we looked at different things about inspiration. We won't get into all of that, but God preserved it. And then the transmission of the text. Okay, so there's not only one copy, there's many copies. So how did there become many copies of the Old Testament? Scribes. And what were the scribes, the original scribes, called? Who can remember?
Some weird Jewish.
Oh my goodness.
Scriptures.
The scribes were called
What's the first letter?
S.
I knew it's something else. I don't know how to pronounce that. Is there an E in it? Is there an E?
The Seraphim
The Seraphim.
are the
original like better, right?
Okay, so the Seraphim were the first ones to begin, and that the word means to count, and they begin to count all the letters and all the lines as they were transcribing the word. You remember the scribes during the time of Jesus. Now, these scribes became the authority on the law. You know why they became the authority on the law?
Because they're
because they copied it so much. They knew it inside and out, right? So that's why the scribes are the ones that they would go talk to, and it had to do with in relation to the law. Okay. So after they come off the scene, the Maseratis take their place. And they took it to an extreme. I mean, if anyone was the perfectionist of the world, it was them. They did all kinds of things. In fact, it was rumored, and I don't know if it's true or not, since none of the Maseratis live any longer, that they could actually take a pen, poke it through a scroll, and tell you every letter that it goes through in the scroll. That's incredible if they can do that, but that was the rumor of what they were able to do. So they're the ones that were responsible in the transmission of the text. Now, for many years, the oldest copies we had were around 1000 AD when it came to the Old Testament. And so many scholars really doubted the validity of the text. And we really didn't have much of an argument, other than we believe that if God is going to hold us accountable to His Word, then He has to preserve it, or else how can He hold us accountable? So good logic would lead you to believe that, but there was no real evidence to prove that until the 1940s, when a shepherd herding some sheep around the region of the Dead Sea, one of his sheep went into a cave, and he took a rock to try to threw a rock to try to scare it to come out. Heard a bunch of crashing, saw some old pottery, thought he had found some really incredible pottery, so he went back and told some archaeologists, and what was in the pottery was a whole lot more impressive than the pottery itself, and that was the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Dead Sea Scrolls were written a long, long time ago, some of them very close to the original writings. And they did a lot of examination of that text, inside and out. And they determined that the manuscripts that we have today are about 99.97% in accuracy to what we have. And none of the scholars that were saying that we didn't have much proof that the transmission of the text was still valid, all had to eat their words, because it's kind of hard to argue with that one. So Dead Sea Scrolls is one of the most important findings in our lifetime, or in modern generation. So that's how we got the Bible and the transmission. Then we talked about the canonization of it, how the Bible books were picked. Okay, because there's other claims of books that should be in here, right? There's the Apocrypha. You've heard of the Apocrypha. So how did they settle on what the Jews would call the 22 books of the Old Testament and what we would call the 39 books? The 39 and the 22 books are the same books. They just divide them differently, and we're going to talk a little bit about that structure today. But just so you know that those were picked, and how were they picked, and why were they picked? You should have been paying attention, not sleeping.
No, I'm trying to think how close.
Because Josephus said so.
Because Josephus definitely makes claim that before Christ, there was definitely a consensus to those 22 books. Okay, so that's important when we start to look for New Testament evidence to support those Old Testament books.
The New Testament mentions most of those books, including Jesus himself references most of those books.
Yeah, so the Old Testament, the structure of the Old Testament was they would have the Torah, okay, which they would call Moses, okay, and then they would have the prophets, and then they would have what's called the writings, okay, or the Psalms. The Psalms was the first book in the group called the writings. And so in the New Testament, you would hear them refer to Moses and the prophets, or Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, right? Well, that's their threefold structure of their Old Testament. That threefold structure was called the Torah, the Nehavim, and the Ketuvim. Later, they put all of those together, put vowels in between the letters, and they called it Tunach. So you've heard the Tunach? It's a made-up word that represents the Old Testament. Okay, so the Tunach. And during the time that Jesus is born and walks on the earth, that had already been established. And He Himself refers to those groupings Himself. He didn't condemn any of the claims that certain books were left out. And there was books to have left out. When Jesus was alive, there was many of the Apocrypha books we had today. The Apocrypha was written between about 200 BC to about 100 AD. Okay, so there was other books that claimed to be from God, and they were rejected. The main reason why they were rejected is because of their intrinsic qualities. Okay, so inspiration is pretty evident when you look at the books themselves. They all are unified, tell the same story. They all claim in some way to either be written by a divine appointee of God, or God making some type of impression on the text itself. So it was really easy to determine which ones need to be in there, and that's how they did it. The Apocrypha, for example, and we're going to kind of go by that. The word Apocrypha actually means hidden. It means hidden, and it was the hidden books that were only for the well-informed. Yeah, it was not for everyone, and so only the special elite got to read from these books, right? That's why they were called that. But they were rejected. And the reason is there's all kinds of inconsistencies within the books. Most of them contradict large portions or small portions of the Old Testament. And many of them are riddled with geographical or even historical blunders. For example, in one of the Apocrypha books, Nebuchadnezzar is a Persian king. That's a problem since Nebuchadnezzar was a Babylonian king, right? So there's all kinds of things like that really disqualify them from being considered as an inspired. And of course, Jesus didn't claim that they should be in there. So none of the New Testament writers write or quote from any of them, and none of the early church fathers do too. Now, if you're well informed, I know you're thinking in your mind right now, well, what about the Book of Enoch? How many of y'all thought of the Book of Enoch when I said that?
Well, I'm going to ask you, in fact, I was getting ready to go there.
Well, the Book of Enoch is not an apocryphal book, by the way. Okay, so it's not an apocryphal book. And the reason why it's not an apocryphal book, because it kind of fell out of an existence. No one really knew where it was until 1830. A Coptic form was found in Egypt. Okay, so that's really when it began to surface. And then later, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, there was an Aramaic version that was about half of the content of the Coptic version. So that's where that came from. Now, here's the deal. There is a quote of Enoch that's mentioned in the book of Jude and in Peter, that he'll come back with 10,000 of his angels. Right, that's the quote. But he never says, as is written in the book of Enoch. He just simply states, as a matter of fact, that as Enoch has prophesied this, this, and this. And so, it would suggest at least that we have to be careful that we don't claim that this is from a particular book. It could have been very much passed down from tradition as a prophetic saying that was agreed by inspiration of the New Testament writer, but never claiming the rest of the content of the book. So we need to be careful with that, because that book is never claimed as an inspiration. Although there are some pretty lofty early church fathers that actually believe that the book of Enoch was inspired. Tertullian was one of them. He actually believed that it was inspired, but in his theory is that it was not preserved. Inspired but not preserved. And so he likens it to a lot of the books that were used for compilation. For example, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the writer writing there makes note of various sources that he put together for that particular material. Even the Gospel of Luke writing about various sources that he used in putting his gospel together. And so in Tertullian's belief, the content was inspired and true, but the book was no longer preserved. It wasn't God's will for it to remain from generation to generation. So that's all I have about the book of Enoch. I know you want a definitive answer from me, but I don't have one. I don't know. I know that if God's desire was to preserve it, He would have preserved it. And I don't know that He would have preserved it as fishy as a Coptic version showing up in 1830s. So I'm happy with the 66 books that we have. I think that what the Enoch has to offer doesn't make or break any of the rest of the books. So I'm good with just being amused by it.
Wasn't Enoch part of the Apocrypha?
No, it's not an apocryphal book. It is the pseudepigrapha. And the pseudepigrapha is just particular books that claim to be written by biblical authors. That may or may not be the case. They call them pseudepigraphas.
What did you call them?
Called you a pseudepigrapha.
He called me a piggrapha.
So like the Gospel of Thomas is a pseudepigrapha, right? But it's If you ever read the Gospel of Thomas, you'll be glad it's not part of the New Testament. It's strange. Paul baptizes a lion, and John rebukes bed bugs out of a hotel and all kinds of. I'm dead serious. Yeah, it's strange. Yeah, so you'll be glad not only that it's not part of it, that other things are not part of our New Testament. So. All right, so that's how we got it. Those are the canonization of the Old Testament. There's a lot of good reason to believe that you hold inspired 39 books preserved by God, and therefore you are accountable to learn and obey all the material therein. All right, so that's what we're going to endeavor to do, is understand it so that we can obey it. All right, so next we're going to talk about it, unless there's any other questions about that, we'll move on. All right, we're going to talk about the structure of the Old Testament. Now, the original structure of the Old Testament came by way of the Hebrews, right? They are the original custodians of God's Word, and they had their own construction of the Old Testament. And I've already made mention of that. They had the where we get the tunic from, and their threefold division. But I'm actually going to read to you about these divisions, so you can kind of see them. So the Torah is the first 5 books of Moses. It's the way we would have them today. They had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now they looked at the Torah as one whole book. Okay, they didn't look at it 5 broke down parts. It was one whole book, but they did divide it in the scroll, and so they would make divisions within the Torah. Okay, so they would consider them part of the 22 as 5, but they believed those 5 divisions represented one whole work, which is the writing of Moses. And then you'd have the prophets, and the prophets were Joshua and Judges. Now Joshua and Judges were together until the translation of the Septuagint, and we'll talk about that. The Book of Kingdoms, which is 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Again, that was divided into the Book of Samuel and the Book of Kings at the writing of the Septuagint. Then you had Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then you had the 12. And that is basically the minor prophets. It's our prophets from, they have Hosea to Malachi. So, those minor prophets, that we would call the minor prophets, were one book, and they called them the 12. Okay? So that would fall under the prophets. And then you'd have the writings. And the writings would be the Psalms, the Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Book of Chronicles. And the Book of Chronicles would be one. Ezra and Nehemiah would be one book. Okay, and that would give you your 22 books. And that's how they divided them all out. So they didn't follow a strict genre, because Ezra and Nehemiah are historical narrative books, just like Joshua would be. But they divided them away from the prophets. And so why do you think they did that?
What was the question again?
Why do you think they divided, since they didn't follow a strict genre, they separated, like Ezra and Nehemiah, under the writings, and they didn't put them under the prophets, like Joshua or Judges, even though the genre is exactly the same? Why do you think they did that?
Do Ezra and Nehemiah prophecies in the book? Were they written at a different time?
Mm-hmm. They were written at a different time.
Well, they have
the prophets had prophecies in those writings. Daniel had prophecies.
Do what?
Daniel's included in the writings.
Daniel's included, and he had prophecies. Right. Yeah, absolutely right. And so you could say, well, okay, the historical timeline maybe was after the Jews left captivity, but they put Daniel in the writings and left Ezekiel in the prophets. So both of those have been written about the same time. So you can't follow a timeline. So why do you think they did that?
I don't know. Why don't you tell me?
I'm going to, but the wheels are still turning.
High school education.
Well, that's okay. All right, so no, the reason why they did it, honestly, and this will floor you, but the reason why they broke them up into levels of importance. So the Torah was their primary concern. They believed all of it was inspired and important. But this is how they would do it. So if you kind of think of them as, because they weren't all one book. They were separate groupings, okay? So the one grouping of scrolls, the law, and then you had the one grouping of scrolls, the prophets, and you had the other grouping, the writings. So if there was a fire that was to break out in your home or in the synagogue, okay, and you could only take one scroll, or one grouping of scrolls, you would take the Torah. If you could only take two groups of scrolls, then you would take the Torah and the prophets. But if you could take three, then you could take all of them. And that is actually why, according to rabbinical tradition, that they divided them up in those categories. So there you go. Otherwise, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense since they don't follow strict genres. So there you go. I don't know that that's a good way of dividing up God's Word. In fact, I don't believe so at all. But that's what they did. And so that's why when you read in the Old Testament, even into the New Testament, you'll read, especially the New Testament, why there was such a huge importance, a level of importance when it came to the law. And that is why they felt it was superior than all other writings. So there you go. All right, so that is obviously not how we have them today, right? Our modern structure is quite different. So how did we get our modern structure? Anyone know? You have a high school education, so I won't ask you.
Someone decided that they should be able to take all of them at once instead of only the Torah or the scriptures or...
Well, the first change came with the Septuagint, as I already made mention. So the Septuagint is what? What is the Septuagint?
When we're like Catholic Church all gathered together, is that what?
No. The Septuagint is the translation of the Hebrew law and then later the rest of the books into Greek. Okay, so when Greek became the universal language of the world, they translated the Hebrew into Greek. And the person who pushed for that was a king. The king of Egypt was named Ptolemy, and it was actually for his library. He had an extravagant library, and he wanted the law written in a language that he could understand. And so he had them do it. And it took 70 men to do that, give or take. And it's debated as to the exact number. But according to the original Greek translation, it says that this is the translation of the 70. So that's from a Greek phrase. Translated into Latin is where we get the word Septuagint. It's a Latin term and it means 70. Okay? Y'all follow that? Okay, so now we have...
Just the law that was translated.
Originally, it was just the law, and then later the rest of the books followed suit. But he wanted the law, and then later the rest were translated. Okay, so then we had the whole, but that's the Septuagint. When the Septuagint was translated, they changed the division. Now, they still followed the law, the prophets, and the writings. What they did is they started dividing up some of the books. As they began to translate into the Greek, they realized that some needful divisions need to be made that was not done before. For example, they knew that there was a difference between the content of Joshua and the content of Judges. And so they separated Joshua and Judges. Same thing with the Kings. So they separated them from 1st and 2nd Samuel. And then they took Lamentations and they put it with Jeremiah. And so as one scroll. So Jeremiah would go right into the book of Lamentations. Things like that. So they kind of changed around. They took the prophets out of the writings and they put them with the other prophets. They did things like that. So that completely changed the structure. But then an even bigger change took place in 380 AD, many years later, when Pope Damascus I hired a man by the name of Jerome to translate the Septuagint into Latin. And we call that the Latin Vulgate. You know what the word Vulgate means?
Something bad.
No, it doesn't mean anything bad. Not vulgar. Vulgate. It means to have common, something in common, to have something in common. Or the text was to be the common text. That was their plan, was to make the Latin the common text of the time. And so Jerome petitioned to the Pope to please let him translate from the original Greek and Hebrew. And they said, denied. He would not let him do it. He could only translate from the Septuagint. So he did. But then he backtracked to make sure that the Septuagint was correct by going back to the original Hebrew and Greek and making changes. Now they knew that they were doing that, and so they ran him out of Rome. They took the work that he did have done, which wasn't complete translation from the Hebrew and Greek, only parts were, and they stopped him from doing that, and then they have what's called the Latin Vulgate. And so that was Jerome. Now Jerome followed a strict genre chronology. Okay, so he would have the order would be in a chronological flow, starting from Genesis all the way down, and then he would keep them in their genres. And so the genres that were picked were the genre of law and historical narrative. That's the first 5 books. Then a regular historical narrative. That's Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. And so those are your historical narratives. And then you'd have the poetry, the genre of poetry, and that would be Job, it would be the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, things that are poetic in nature. And then you'd have the prophets, and he divided the prophets into sub-genres, and that was major and minor prophets. Okay, I wish he would have never done that, but he did, unfortunately, and that's how we've studied it ever since, and it's not good, but nonetheless, it's how it is. So the major and minor prophets, and he divided the major from the minor prophets based on the length of the books. Okay, that's about as helpful as dividing the epistles from their lengths. I mean, making major and minor epistles. It's silly, but that's what he did. So major and minor prophets. And then those are your structured, modern structure of the Old Testament today. Is there any questions about that? All right. So before we do an introduction to the Torah, which is the first set of books that we'll be studying as part of our study, I want us to look at a few things here. Now, for you to know kind of the direction of this study as we look at the Old Testament, we're going to follow what is called a diachronic study. Anybody know what a diachronic study is? Our diachronical study?
It's made up of 2 words, dio.
Oh my goodness. All right. So basically what it is, it's a study that has 3 emphasis. Okay, unlike some studies that would emphasize on one thing, it tries to emphasize 3 equally, and that is, it tries to be expositional in its approach. Now, what does expositional mean? Don't try to break down the word. Just if you know it, just tell me. Expositional.
Expository.
Yeah, it's an expository. It's to take it verse by verse, right? To take something verse by verse so that you can understand the content and context of the passages that you're studying. So it's going to be expositional in its approach, but it's going to be chronological in its progression. In other words, it's going to follow a strict chronology. So it's not going to look at just genres. It's not going to do all the genres at the same time. It's going to put them all together and follow them in a chronological flow. And the third thing that it does is it tries to be theological in its aim. So as it does that progression, it's going to take theological concepts and it's going to continue to build on them. Now that doesn't mean that I'm not going to cheat and go to the New Testament for clarity. I will do that. I assure you of that. Or other parts of the Bible. That doesn't mean you can't look at them. It's just that we need to be respectful of the progression of that revelation when it relates to those theological concepts. And at the end, I think that you will have a superior understanding of the Bible when you put those emphasis together. All right, so that's what we're going to try to do.
Let me continue to summarize. So you're saying it's contextual but progressive in chronology.
Yes.
Those are the 2 things.
Yes, but theological, the aim is going to be theological. So in other words, we're not just going to try to understand its history and its, just whatever the context or the purpose. We're trying to build broad theological understandings of those particular books. So you can take the book of Genesis, for example, and you can study the book of Genesis, and then you can kind of set it aside. Then you can go study, the book of Romans, right? But what we're trying to do is put all of the concepts, theological concepts together and kind of build them as we go along. And so what we understand in Genesis, we're going to take into Exodus. And what we understand in Genesis and Exodus, we're going to take into the book of Leviticus. And we're going to build that way, if that makes sense. Where a lot of studies don't do that.
We're going to pack our bags as we go.
Yeah, right. We're not going to forget about Genesis when we enter in Exodus, and so forth.
And how would this liken to dispensationalism at all?
No, it doesn't. Dispensationalism is a hermeneutical method.
Well, I'm talking about the dispensations within chronology.
I don't know. Yeah, so dispensationalism is a method of interpretation. So it's not a style of study. So you can follow a diachronic study and have a dispensational method. You could do that. You would just study the progression.
I didn't know if there was any alignment. In other words, if you're studying within chronology, there's also obvious dispensations of time within chronology.
Oh, so you're not talking about the theology dispensationalism.
Not necessarily.
You're
no.
talking.
Well, I am, but yes and no. I guess let's not get sidetracked.
Okay.
Sounds like the two paths.
We're definitely taking two diverse paths as we have this conversation. Yeah. All right. Maybe that'll, as we go, that'll answer your question, but I'm not really sure I answer that. Okay, so we're going to look at historical narrative real quick. How much time do we have?
15 minutes.
Really? That's it?
5 actually.
5 minutes?
No, you have about 10. Really? Let me see your clock.
Okay, about 10 minutes. Okay, we'll try to get through this.
Your introduction was like 45 minutes.
Okay, well then I'm going to continue on because y'all are late.
Well, you started
Let's keep
late.
going.
Good, thank you.
Stop bickering. He's got to teach.
Thank you. I like it. All right. So historical narrative. Now I'm gonna. Now so we're looking at. First of all, let me back up. I'm kind of going too fast. The introduction to the.
Just say your introduction was 45 minutes.
Hush. All right. So I got all these papers. I got to make sure that. Okay. So the introduction to the Torah. I want to talk about the various overview of the Torah, and we kind of looked at some of this. So I'm not going to rehash a lot of it. But the dating of the Torah, the writing of the Torah, we already looked at. Was being written about 1420 BC. We've already established that. This is all in your notes, so you can go back and read it if you need to. But then we looked at the authorship, and we kind of already established that Moses was the writer of the Torah. No one really disputes that unless you're a liberal. Okay, you're a liberal theologian. You not a Democrat, a theologian, right? A liberal theologian. They're the only ones that really dispute it because it's really a slam dunk case. I mean, you have to pretty much bury your head in the sand to come to a different conclusion. And there's various reasons to believe that. First of all, the Pentateuch itself says that it was written by Moses, so that's kind of hard to get around. I left you all kinds of verses for you to go look at that. And all throughout the Old Testament, it's all referred to the writing of Moses. So no one ever contributes it to any other person than Moses. Okay, Joshua says that the book of the law was handed down by the hand of Moses. So I mean, I don't know how you get around that. Then further on, Jesus called it the book of Moses, right? So I mean, if Jesus says it's written by Moses, I don't know who's going to argue with that. And then all of the early church fathers all said the same thing. I have all these verses. I have tons of verses for you to spend all your time combing through and looking at. But I assure you that Moses wrote it. That to me, it is so silly that we can just move on. All right. So authorship is Moses.
He wrote the Pentateuch.
The Pentateuch. Okay, yeah, the Pentateuch is another name for the Torah. Penta is 5 in Greek, and Tuch is scroll. So it's the 5 scroll. All right, so that's the same as Moses. The five books of Moses. Okay, but thank you because I didn't mention that. All right, so but we do have to answer a question because I know what Hannah's thinking. She's thinking, all right, Brother Trey, I follow you so long, but you say these things, and I don't know. If Moses wrote all of that, how in the world did he write about the flood? How did he write about Cain and Abel? How did he write about Adam and Eve? How did he write about those things? Why is that a problem?
Because he
wasn't alive to see it. So how can he write about it? Most people write books about the time in which they were living, right? So how did he do it?
Oral tradition and inspiration.
Yeah, just the same thing as the first what we said about 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we said about the Gospel of Luke. A compilation of sources. It does not deduct from inspiration. Inspiration is the accuracy of preserving truth. It doesn't say anything about the means or way that in fact they do it. All right, and it could be that God gave him supernatural revelation. I certainly don't dispute that. God is certainly capable of going down and telling Moses exactly what to write, and that might have been the case, or he might have actually used other sources. But either way, the compilation of those events were put together and written by Moses. Okay, so that's what I'm referring to. So is that clear? Everybody go with that? Okay.
Did he use the Ummah and Thurman?
Huh? He might have. Thurman, he might have. He consulted with the high priest. The priest went and told him. I don't know. All right, so now we're going to...
Well, real fast. So then during the time of Moses, obviously the Torah was not put together, or was in the process of being put together by his writings. All right. So the Israels was being led by Moses. Were just entirely under his teaching. All right. That would have been the only place where they would have received divine information.
Okay.
Obviously, they would have had the Torah to look at, would they have?
Oh, I see what you're saying. The people being responsible to the Word of God. No, they would have been through the oration of Moses. Now, he would have been writing that very quickly as a copy that could be understood. Now, really quickly after he receives the law, God tells him to write a copy and put it in the sleeve compartment of where the priests were in worship. So there was a written copy. It was from that copy that kings were to write the law for themselves. That was part of the duty of being a king. They had to write for themselves their own copy of the law, and it was supposed to be from that original source, from the priest. So he had a copy of it really quickly. But I don't know that all of it was there. But definitely Moses would have been able to tell them what they needed to know.
So, but if you were an Israelite at that time, of course you probably couldn't have even read anyways. But everything was basically you were following a charismatic leader who seemed to have divine intervention.
That's true, and you're absolutely correct. And that is.
Is that accurate?
No, that's accurate.
Why would there not have been accounts? Most of
there were accounts.
Verbal accounts of creation. I mean, it wouldn't have been like Moses just one day woke up and started leading the people. I mean, these traditions and the history probably was passed down.
No, that's true too. But I mean, and there was, in a sense, really a group following a charismatic leader. I agree that there's an element there. That's why there was these uproars and disputes and people thinking they can do their own thing, and then God would prove them that they couldn't. I mean, God constantly was verifying that
stuff that he did that didn't explain, that wasn't explainable by man's terms. Like all of his miracles that he performed.
Yeah, right. So God would validate Moses as his man by various miracles. I mean, he grabbed a staff and parted the Red Sea. I mean, I would have been like, okay, you're definitely from God.
Well, what is your question?
Is that what?
No, that wasn't a question.
Yeah, so I mean, there was an element of that.
Trying to come to an understanding of if I was an Israelite during the Exodus, what would my experience be?
Most of
Well,
Genesis.
since you have a hate for authority, I mean,
Well, okay, but yeah, that's why Moses said, "Look, if I go tell these people that you've sent me, they're going to say, who's the God that sent you?" And he gives them miracles that he can show the people that he was actually from God to validate that he is who he says he is. And so that was why that was important. I mean, if it was a matter of going back and looking at the scriptures to see if those things be so, there would have been no dispute. So.
Most of Genesis was probably established oral tradition, much in the way that the writings of Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey were verbal traditions passed down to the Greeks until somebody wrote it down. For the Odyssey and the Iliad, it was Homer. For Genesis, it was
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would distinguish the two with the working of the Holy Spirit in the lives of the people who wrote it, of course. But yeah, I agree that a lot of the information would have been passed down information. Obviously, Noah is the one that's going to have to tell the story about the flood, since him and his sons are the only ones that are there, right? all the eyewitnesses didn't live to tell the story, right? Yeah, so I agree that there's an element of that. Huh? All right, so we looked real quick at the content this is kind of a rough outline of the Torah, and so you can break it. This is my breaking down. This is certainly not inspired. This is how I understand the natural breakdown of the Torah. But so an outline could be Genesis 1 through 11. You have the primeval history. That is the early history of mankind. So where we get all the origins from, and we're going to see that theme all throughout primeval history when we study it. Then Genesis 12 through 50, you have patriarchal history, and that is Abraham and his seed, all the way down to Joseph having.
yeah, what are you looking at?
We don't have to look. I can tell it to you, but you can look if you want.
Oh, I see it. Page 2.
So Genesis 12 through 50 is patriarchal history, the early fathers. And then Exodus 1 through 18 would be the Exodus, okay? Moses taking the children out of the bondage. Then Exodus 19:1 through Numbers 10:10 would be the Sinai covenant, or you might call it the Mosaic covenant, or the law. This is the time that God gave the law over an 11-month period. All right? And then Numbers 10:11 through Numbers 25:18, you have the apostasy of Israel and the 40 years of wandering. All right? and those that occurred then. And then Numbers 26 through Deuteronomy 34 is the preparation for a new generation. That's when God took the next generation and brought them into the promised land. So that's how you can kind of break down the outline of the Torah. And then the genre that is used in the Torah is historical narrative and law. Historical narrative and law. There's a lot of law, but the majority of it is historical narrative. And so we're going to look at historical narrative just quickly as a genre. Now I'm not going to talk about the law yet. We'll talk about the law when we get to the book of Exodus that deals with the law. Because if I tell you about the law now, you're going to forget by the time we get there. And it's important. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the genre of law because I think it's one of the most misunderstood at least the hermeneutics aspect of the law of all the genres. So, we're going to talk about historical narrative. So the first thing is, what is a historical narrative? What is it? What are the components that make up a historical narrative?
Morgan Freeman talking.
Okay, there's a narrator. You cannot have a narrative without a narrator, right? So there's a narrator, not Morgan Freeman, but the various writers who are telling the story are the narrator. So there's a narrator. What else?
Narrator telling a story.
Okay, so
Got a story with factual events.
okay, they're factual events. So we have characters, we have a setting. Did you want to say one? I'm sorry.
Oh, that one was running what John.
Huh?
You asked me, you said, what's the genre? I said, that's on the trade. Don't ask me.
A genre is like a literary style or even a musical style. People talk about genre of music, but it's a literary style. So it's the content of writing. So you would say that there's a funnies in the newspaper. That's a style of genre that would be comedic, right? It's satire and comedy, right? Then you have a medical journal. Yeah, that's facts based on observation, at least it's supposed to be, right? So those are different the way you would interpret those, right? Yeah, that's all we're talking about is genre. Is that well enough? Okay. Huh? Genre? No, it's not genre. It's genre. All right, so genre. Okay, so there's a narrator, there's characters, or it's a character or characters, right? There is a setting, okay? There is a place and time. And then there is a plot. There is a story to be told. There's some event that we're talking about or something as far as plot. And then there's a plot resolution, right? There's an intended purpose of the story. Or it's going somewhere, unlike conversations that you have with Matt Lindy. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. All right. So what's the purpose of a historical narrative? As far as the biblical historical narrative, what is its purpose? Okay. If you read, you can just read it, but there's a lot of information. So I simplified it in my notes and say number one is to give a coherent, factual account of an event or events. Okay. It's to give a coherent, factual storyline of particular events. Okay, it's got to be coherent. Now, the author wasn't writing in a way that only a select few can understand him, or you have to have some special mystic knowledge in order to understand it. He was writing it in plain Hebrew for the Hebrews to understand, and then later was translated into plain English so we can understand it. Right. So the purpose is to write it in a coherent way and to be factual. Okay, he was trying to give facts. He wasn't making up stories. So none of these are allegoricals. They're not cute little parables to try to get a story across. They were actual factual events. Okay? And the second thing is to relate these events from a divine viewpoint or to a theological position. Okay? So what do those mean? Put in a simple summary is that when it comes to the practical matters of interpreting biblical history, the fact that it is both history and theology means that first we must respect the historical integrity of the text, and that second we must recognize a purpose deeper than the telling what actually happened from a human standpoint. So in other words, okay, we cannot divorce from the factual events that they are writing under a theological viewpoint. Okay, they're telling us this story because God is at its center, right? And the events that unfold are important to us because they tell us about who God is. about what He expects out of mankind and the relationship that He is developing between them. All right, so that is the driving purpose. Okay, but I left some principles that we need to understand when we go to interpret a historical narrative, unless we get into some trouble. Okay, and those are written for you to read along with me under principles of interpretation of interpreting historical narratives. All right, number one, narratives usually do not directly teach a doctrine. That is important. Okay, when Moses was writing, I'm not suggesting that he didn't have theology in mind, at least how he would have understood revelation in his time. But his purpose in writing historical narratives was not trying to teach you doctrine. Okay, we have a source, a primary source that we can go to understand doctrine, and what is that? Okay, there is within the teaching of Jesus. I agree. Even though the writers themselves, the books were writing about biographical history, Jesus' teaching certainly would be a source for doctrine. But the epistles' purpose are primarily to teach doctrine, to take the events that are in historical narrative and explain the significance of them. All right. So that doesn't mean that in the historical narrative that we can't come to a significance. It doesn't even mean that the writer can't explain some significance of those particular events, because he may well do that. But what it means is that we don't go and try to identify doctrine primarily out of the historical narratives. We're just trying to gather the facts. Okay? All right, so number two, narratives record what happened, not always what should have happened. Okay, that's important, right? Because some people get all mixed up and they think that because even a prophet does something that it means it's okay for us to do it. The writer is just telling you what happened. He's not always telling you if that should or should not have happened. For example, Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah, and then he decides that he'll work 7 more years, and he gets Rachel, right? So does that mean that it's okay to have 2 wives? Okay. So just because Jacob did it doesn't mean that it's okay. Another thing, and you remember Noah, after he gets off the ark, his debacle and drunkenness, right? He gets drunk, his sons expose his nakedness, and one of them's cursed for it, right? Okay? So God starts to deal with the cursed son. Nothing is ever said about Noah and his drunkenness. Not one time did God condemn it. Now, if Noah had not been drunk, the whole situation would not have happened, right? But he never condemns it. So does that mean that God approves drunkenness? No, because we can go in the New Testament. It says to be not drunk wherein is excess, right? So obviously, God is not pleased with drunkenness, although He never condemns it in that story. So you got to be careful. Just because they did it, don't mean it's okay for you to do it. All right. Number 3, what people do in narratives is not necessarily good for us to do. And again, I kind of expounded on that with verse 2 or number 2. Number 4, we are not always told at the end of a narrative if what happened was good or bad. We are expected to judge this on the basis of what is explicitly taught elsewhere, and I've kind of already even lumped all that together. Number 5, not all the details of the actual event is always given in the narrative. What does appear in the narrative is everything the inspired author thought we should know, and that's also important. Again, these people are telling historical events, right? But they are not historians. Moses is not trying to give the most detailed of history of the event. Okay, he's trying to explain it within the backdrop of a theological viewpoint. Okay, so there may have been a lot of things that were happening in those events that he didn't write about because they were not significant to his theological viewpoint. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. That's big with biographical history as well. When we get into the Gospels were not written in a chronological format. That wasn't what their intention. There is a chronological flow. Obviously, Jesus was born before He died, and those things like that. They get all that right. But there's dispute as to certain events and when they inspire with others, right? But because they weren't writing chronologically, they were writing thematically. They took various aspects of His life and they put them in a thematical form so that we can follow its understanding within a doctrinal viewpoint. Okay, so they were doctrinally driven in writing about these events because they realized that a man coming and living and dying, the reason why we need to tell this story is because it has a theological significance. Right. Same thing with the historical narratives. All right, number 6. Narratives are not written to answer all our theological questions. Though they may help in understanding a theological concept, they have a limited purpose and only deal with certain issues, leaving other issues to be dealt with in other passages. Okay? So you cannot go to a historical narrative and deduct from it all there is to know about a particular doctrine. Be very leery and careful of that. People do that. They go to history and they try to develop, all that there needs to be on a particular doctrine. And God's or the writer's intention was not for that purpose. Okay? Is there any questions about any of that? All right. How much time do we have? All right, real quick, because I don't want to cheat you. Just turn to your Bibles to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, and we'll be done shortly. And so we're going to follow this outline here. This is the Primeval History, the Torah Part 1. And we're going to be looking for the next few days at the origin of the universe. The origin of the universe. Now, we're not going to try to squeeze out of these verses all that we can find, okay? Otherwise, we will never finish this study, all right? We'll never get to the end. You could literally spend months in just the creation story. So we're not going to do that. I will try to contain myself, but we're going to try to look at an overview all of this information. And so the origin of the universe is found in chapter 1, and it extends through chapter 2, verse 3. Okay, so the divisions of our Bible, chapters and verses, were not inspired. They're not part of the original writings. So when Moses was writing, he didn't write verse 1, and then you go down to verse 2. He didn't do that, or even make chapters, right? That was later added for our convenience. And a lot of it, they get absolutely correct, and are extremely helpful. But I think they made a blunder on this one, because if you understand historical narratives as they were written by the Hebrews, then you would understand that it was very common, by way of introduction, to write what is called it just slipped my mind. Hold on. Inclusio. It just kind of disappeared. You know what an inclusio is? What is an inclusio? Jesus used several inclusios, actually. We won't look at that, but he did. An inclusio is basically when you have an introduction theme to what you're about to say, and then you close it, or a summary of the information that you were just given. Okay, so he does this here. It says in verse 1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," right? So he's telling us where he's going. That's just a theme. He's telling us, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Now he's going to expound on that in the rest of the verses. Okay? But then he concludes in chapter 2, in verse 3, "And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in that he rested from all his work which God had created and made." And so, or verse 2 actually says, "Thus," I was actually looking for verse 1. He's expounding on the summary. But in verse 1 of chapter 2, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished." Okay, so in the first one he says, "In the beginning God does this." He explains what he does. And then in this final statement he's explaining the conclusion to what he just did. That's what it's an inclusio. Basically, it's grouping the information together. Okay? So,
Basically, it's like writing an essay at school.
It is. Yeah, it was the first essay writers. Yeah, they were. You'd have a theme, a body, and a summary, right? And that's basically what we have here. And so that's how we know that should conclude and not be a second chapter. So it's an inclusio here. And this chapter is going to be broken down into 4 points for our convenience. The creator of the universe, the creation of the universe, the crowning of the universe, the completion of the universe. So the first thing I want to look at real quickly is the creator of the universe. Okay, so this is starting in verse 1. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Okay. So, in the beginning is one word in Hebrew. It's the Hebrew word Bereshit. Okay, and it actually means in the beginning. Okay, it's where the Latin translators get the word for Genesis. Okay, the Greek word is arche, and the Latin word is origin, and it's where we get origins from, and it means the beginning, right? And so that's where we get the book of Genesis from, and it means the beginning. Now the reason why they did that is because Hebrews would refer to books by the first word of that book. That's where they would call this the book of Bereshit. Okay, so the book of the beginnings, and so in the beginning. Now, the word actually means a starting point in a process. Okay, so it gives to the reader the idea that a process is about to take place, and I'm going to give you the starting point. Okay, so the starting point here is what?
The beginning.
Well, the beginning is the starting point is kind of obvious. So what starts the beginning?
Creation.
The creation, right. The creation is the starting point, is the beginning. So the beginning of time begins with the creation of the universe. Now we're going to break down all of this, but it won't be today. But I want to just point out two things that we can absolutely conclude just by reading this first verse. Now, I'm going to tell you that it is not an accident that the writer writes in this way. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. He is driving home the idea that this chapter is about Him. In fact, the book is about Him. In fact, all the books are about Him. This is not a science book. The writer is not trying to wow us in the understanding of science. He is trying to get us to understand something about God. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And that is, He is the creator of all things. The beginning of time begins because He says so. Okay? And that's what He is driving home. That's why His name dominates the chapter. Okay, you read, Elohim is written, several times throughout this chapter, and it's because that is the primary concern that we need to have as readers of this chapter. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So if the beginning is the creation of the universe, then that means God existed prior to the beginning, and thus He has no beginning. Right? He is in fact eternal. He's eternal. And Psalm 90 in verse 2 tells us that from everlasting to everlasting Thou art God. Right? From the past all the way and to the future all the way, He is eternal. From everlasting to everlasting, He is God. All right? And if He is eternal, then we can conclude from that He is immutable. What does it mean to be immutable? He doesn't change. He can't be eternal if He's changed. Right? You cannot have a process of change if you are eternal. That's why we know that the universe itself cannot be eternal. Because the universe is in fluctuation and changes. You can't have an eternal change to a universe. Right? So that's how we can, without any hesitation and absolute logic, determine that the universe itself cannot be eternal. Alright, but God is. God is eternal. He does not change. And then the other thing that we can see here is that there is only one God. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It didn't say in the gods. It didn't talk anything about polytheism. Now, this would have been an attack on the polytheistic society that Moses delivered his people from, would it not? Okay, so there is definitely an emphasis on this fact that in the beginning there was only one, and that was Jehovah God, and He is the creator of all there is. And we are going to study all about Him when we come back next time. So, all right, we'll conclude with that. Any questions or comments? We will actually be in the Bible next time, so I know y'all excited about that. So.
Hey, real fast.
Yes.
I know that you talked a little bit about the books, but obviously the books are broken up by verses and verses.
Yes,
numbers.
they are. Stephanus in 1630s is the one who actually did that for us. So.
And so, as you're referencing that break there in Genesis, before that, there wouldn't have been.
There would have been no breaks. Yeah, they would just.
No punctuation.
There was no punctuations. He's right. There was not. There weren't even vowels originally. So it would have been very difficult. Now there's vowels in Greek. So the Greek writers would have had vowels, and they would have punctuations, at least forms of punctuation in Greek. But the Old Testament would not have been the case. It would have been very difficult. Any other questions or comments? That was good.
You mentioned God being singular, but that form of God is plural, right?
Well, Elohim is a plural word, okay, but it's not interpreted as more than one God. The emphasis is not to make him more than one being. It's plural, and it's what they call pluralistic majesty. Basically, it uses the name in a mighty way by making it a plural of majesty, but all the pronouns that are ever associated with that word are all singular. So in the beginning, when it says that he did this, it's all the verbiage. It points, because the verbs would also be, unlike our verbs in English, would have been either plural or singular depending on the subject. And the subject, even though it uses a plural form of the word, it's understood by the writers that he was singular in nature.
Are you going to go into that? I mean, because a lot of people use that in reference to the triune God.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that is what its purpose is. I will talk about the Trinity when we get to, and God said, "Let us make man in our image," and I will. Those are plural pronouns, and so now that changes. And so, who is that, which was not before? And I will kind of discuss that with the. Of course, I am Trinitarian, so we'll talk about the Trinitarian view of God.
Let's make sure we get a full hour to talk about that.
Okay. All right. But as far as Elohim, that might very well mean, for understanding it, as a triune God. And I have not disputing that at all. But that type of phrasing is used to refer to kings and all kinds of things. And no one believed that kings were triune. So we have to be careful with that.
True, but in the context of the whole passage,
it very well could be possible. The Trinity doesn't need its help from Elohim. It's easily deducted by other passages of the Bible.
But when in context.
If that is a view hold, I mean, as far as I don't dispute that. I'm careful. I just want to be careful.
I just don't want you to be wrong. But I mean, not that I'm saying.
I may be wrong. Anything else? Those are good questions.